Welcome to the 25th episode of Arbiter of Worlds. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for supporting the channel. If you're new to the channel, hello. Here at Arbiter of Worlds, we study the art and science of running and creating tabletop role-playing games. Today, we're going to tackle timekeeping in RPGs. If you're active in RPG Twitter, you'll already know this has been a timely topic, as timekeeping has been a very lively point of discussion. But why? That's the first question we have to answer. Why should a GM care about timekeeping? The best answer to this question is found on page 37 of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. There, in the section called Time in the Campaign, Gary Gygax writes the following. Game time is of utmost importance. Failure to keep careful track of time expenditure by player characters will result in many anomalies in the game. The stricture of time is what makes recovery of hit points meaningful. Likewise, the time spent adventuring in wilderness areas removes concerned characters from their bases of operation, be they rented chambers or battlemented strongholds. Certainly, the most important time stricture pertains to the manufacture of magic items, for during the period of such activity, no adventuring can be done. Time is also considered in gaining levels and learning new languages and more. All of these demands upon game time force choices upon player characters and likewise number the days of their game life. Gygax then goes on, one of the things stressed in the original game of D&D was the importance of recording game time with respect to each and every player character in a campaign. In AD&D, it is emphasized even more. You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. That last sentence is in all caps in the book. It's one of the only usages of all caps in the entire DMG. Gary was not effing around with time. All right, so then Gygax finishes his section on time and campaign with the following passage. You may ask why time is so important if it causes difficulties with record keeping, dictates who can or cannot go adventuring during a game session, and disperses player characters to the four winds by its strictures. Well, as initially pointed out, it is a necessary penalty imposed upon characters for certain activities. Beyond that, it also gives players yet another interesting set of choices and consequences. The latter tends to bring more true-to-life quality to the game, as some characters will use precious time to the utmost advantage, some will treat it lightly, and some will be consistently wasting it to their detriment. Time is yet another facet which helps to separate the superior players from the lesser ones. If timekeeping is a must from a penalty standpoint, it is also an interesting addition from the standpoint of running a campaign. Now, it's great to see Gygax here emphasizing player agency and verisimilitude as core reasons for careful timekeeping. These are the same facets I would stress. I would add one additional reason why timekeeping is important. Fairness. Game time is one of the most valuable resources in an RPG. As a GM, you should be neutral with regards to the passage of time for your players' characters. The necessity for fairness means that each player character must experience the flow of time at the same rate. And that's true whether we're talking about fairness at the tactical level or fairness over the course of a campaign. Imagine how unreasonable it would be if you had a different rate of time for different players. Let's imagine that you run such that time passes half as quickly for Bob's PC than for Jim's PC. So Bob gets to take 2 turns in the same combat round, while Jim only gets to take 1 turn. In the absence of a spell or some other justification, that would just be grossly unfair. And the same is true at the campaign level. It would be grossly unfair if with 1 week of downtime, Bob can do 2 weeks of work because time passes differently for him, while Jim's PC only gets to do 1 week, and so on. So to avoid that unfairness, you must keep strict time records that guarantee that no one is getting more or less time for their character than they ought to. Okay, let's go back to the Testament of St. Gygax. After mandating that strict time records be kept, Gygax then explains the methods by which the DM ought to keep time. Now, it's too lengthy to repeat all of Gary's advice here, but the key thing to know is that his approach is designed to allow the GM to manage multiple parties of different player characters operating in different areas in the same campaign. This is a type of campaign that's often called a Braunstein, and you can Google that term if you're curious about its origin. How is this Braunstein to be accomplished? Gary explains that it is best to use 1 actual day equals 1 game day when no play is happening. For instance, let's imagine that when you run session 1 in the real world, it's September 11th, and in the game world, it's the 11th day of the month of Darktide. If you run session 2 on September 18th, then 7 days have passed in the real world, and so if you follow Gygax's rule, therefore 7 days have passed in the game world, and it's now the 18th day of Darktide. Time passed at the same rate, real world to game world. And this idea that one actual day equals one game day has been called one-to-one time. Now, Gygax's focus on one-to-one time was to enable multiple groups to operate in the same game world. And that seems antiquated to many people in our hobby. And these critics question the utility of this approach because nowadays, many GMs can't even find a single group to play with, let alone several groups. And up until recently, virtually all contemporary RPGs were in fact being played with one GM running one group, and usually in sort of a short story-driven campaign. The idea of a sprawling, open, multi-group campaign that takes months and years of real-world time had largely been abandoned since the early 1980s. Recently, however, this Braunstein campaign style has received renewed attention, largely because of the evangelical efforts of a group of Twitter users who call themselves the hashtag BroSR. If you are gentle of heart and meek of demeanor, like I am, I would advise you to keep a cautious distance from the BroSR because they are more fanatical and intransigent about their playstyle than an inquisitor from the Vatican on a bad day. They even have their own cardinal. However, they also really know what they're doing, and they've begun to run large-scale multi-polity campaigns that rely on one-to-one time to coordinate the activities of the different participants, and they're having a blast doing it. I support the general agenda of large-scale, long-term campaigns that this approach encourages, and I see the utility of one-to-one time for their purposes. However, I part ways with Gygax and the BroSR when they claim that one-to-one time is strictly necessary. Instead, I believe that having time pass for all player characters at a fixed rate of one actual day to one game day is just a special case of the general rule I elaborated earlier, which is that each player character must experience the flow of time at the same rate. It doesn't matter if that rate is 1-to-1, 3-to-1, 1-to-3, 10-to-1, or even variable. What matters is that the same rules apply to all participants. And so when we realize that our real mandate is to maintain consistency of time passage across the player characters, then we realize that so-called one-to-one time is actually a bit of a misnomer, because time only passes at a 1-to-1 rate under Gygax's method when no play is happening. When play is happening, the Gygaxian method permits time to pass at a faster or slower rate. For instance, imagine that the GM runs a session for Bob and Jim on September 11th, aka Darktide 11th. During that session, Bob and Jim's PCs fight in a melee that lasts 5 minutes of game time, but takes 15 minutes of real-world time to resolve. Well, now game time passed at a rate of 1-to-3 relative to actual time. After the fight, Bob and Jim's PCs set out on a wilderness trek that takes 2 weeks of game time and 3 hours of real-world time to resolve. Now game time is passed at a rate of 112-to-1 relative to actual time. And at the end of the session, Bob and Jim's PCs are now at the game date of 25th Darktide, since 14 game days passed since they set out on the 11th. Now let's assume that at the end of the session, Bob and Jim's PCs had arrived at their destination, the holy sanctuary of the noble lady, and it's this beautiful alabaster temple in an elven forest, and they fall asleep to songs of sylphs and unicorns. And this was a good stopping point, and that's where the GM ended the session. Now let's say a week passes in which nobody plays a session. On 18th September, Bob and Jim gather at the GM's house for another session, and they're joined by 2 other players, Brian and Chris. Last session took place on 11th Darktide. Since 1 week of real-world time has passed, following Gygax's rule, 1 week of in-game time has passed, so now it is the 18th of Darktide. And this presents a conundrum, because for Bob and Jim's PCs, it's 25th Darktide. So what should the GM do? Well, here's what Gygax recommends. He says that the GM should leave Bob and Jim's PCs on the 25th of Darktide ahead of the current timeline, and then, in order to play in the session, Bob and Jim should roll up an alternative set of player characters who can be active on the 18th of Darktide. And then they can adventure with Brian and Chris if they want, and Bob and Jim's main PCs become available in 7 real-world days, that is 25th September, aka 25th Darktide. But this Gygaxian solution carries with it the seed of a new problem. Let's imagine that Brian's character owns a flying carpet capable of travel at terrific speeds. And Brian and Chris's PCs fly to the holy sanctuary of the noble lady. And from their magic carpet, they get to the holy sanctuary in just 3 game days, arriving on the 21st of Darktide. And when they arrive, Brian and Chris firebomb the holy sanctuary from the sky and reduce it to a smoking ruin. Then they land at the sanctuary to search its rubble for treasure, and they spend 4 days doing so, advancing their character's timeline to 25th Darktide. And now we see the problem. Brian and Chris's PCs have created a temporal paradox. It was already established in Session 1 that Bob and Jim's PCs arrived at the Holy Sanctuary on the 25th and found it intact with sylphs and unicorns. But in Session 2, Brian and Chris destroyed the Holy Sanctuary on the 21st, and they were in its ruins when the 25th rolled around on Session 3. Now, the fine gentlemen of the BroSR have asserted to me that this isn't really a problem. They say that in the course of their campaign, such complexities simply have not arisen. I believe them. However, one thing I've learned over the years as a game designer is this. Just because one group or one set of groups doesn't encounter a problem with a rule, it doesn't mean another group won't have a huge problem with the rule. And in fact, I am besieged daily on my Autark Discord by gamers asking me to offer rulers on this or that edge case that I literally never imagined would come up, but are real problems for their campaign. In addition, in the DMG, Gygax openly admits this is a real problem for his method of timekeeping. Potentially a big problem, he says, in all caps again. If Gary Gygax thought it was a serious enough problem to put it in all caps and spend a paragraph addressing, I think we can safely say that temporal paradox is a genuine problem that can occur when using variable time during the session and one-to-one time outside of a session. So how does Gary solve the problem? He suggests, slightly paraphrasing, despite time differences, the activities that have previously occurred should be allowed to stand, as destiny has decreed those events. So Gary is essentially calling for the RPG version of the Novikov self-consistency principle of temporal paradox, also known as Larry Niven's law of conservation of history. And to quote physicist J. Craig Wheeler, according to the consistency conjecture, any complex interactions must work themselves out self-consistently so that there is no temporal paradox. In effect, this means that Brian and Chris have to be deprived of the ability to arrive at and destroy the Holy Sanctuary, because doing so would create a paradox. So for instance, the GM might rule that Brian and Chris get lost and don't find the Holy Sanctuary until the 26th. The GM might decide that terrible thunderstorms with high winds cause delays to air travel so that flying carpets don't arrive until the 26th. The GM might manufacture a special encounter designed to delay or divert the party so they don't reach the Holy Sanctuary, and on and on. Proponents of Gygax's methods consider these to be workable solutions. I don't. All of these techniques boil down to railroading players into doing what the GM wants them to do, rather than what the players want to do and the rules say they can do. And railroading players is anathema to player agency and to an objective game world. Now, Gygax, to his credit, acknowledges his solution is a necessary evil. Today, however, many people who would ridicule the Dragonlance adventures for advocating that the GM railroad the players so they don't disrupt the story will celebrate Gygax's advice that the GM railroad the players so they don't disrupt the timeline. They shouldn't. Railroading is bad, regardless of why it's being done. Railroading to maintain a timeline reduces player agency just as much as railroading to maintain a storyline. Now, Gygax's self-consistency principle might actually be a necessary evil for multi-party play in a shared world, but it's still an evil. And because it's an evil, we should ask our next question. Is there a better way to handle this problem of temporal paradoxes? Has advancement in game design and social media technology made it possible to solve this problem in ways that were unavailable to Gary back in 1979? Maybe. But that, my friends, will be the topic of next week's video. For now, please take the time to click on the like and subscribe buttons and leave a comment, and I will see you in 1 week, during which time exactly 7 days will pass in game.